Hello everyone, and welcome to our second webinar. It's good to see that some more of you have been attempting the questions, the discussions on the forum. It's good to see you posting on the forum. I think I might have maybe said last week that much of the material for the first 2 weeks cover concepts that you need to learn simply by doing calculations, and you won't learn much simply by listening to me talking. It really requires action in the form of undertaking calculations, learning to apply formula, which is why there are lots of study papers for these 2 weeks. Normally, in a normal USEM course, you wouldn't see more than one study paper per week, and these generally wouldn't be more than 20 pages, but these weeks you are getting two with at least 30 or 40 pages or so. As I mentioned last week, some of it will just be revision. What are the things? Please remember to post your feedback. There's anonymous feedback on the VLE. We use this feedback to try and improve next year's module. Remember last year on File 7 VAE, I had lots of responses. Some were saying that the webinars were too long. Other people were complaining that the webinars were too short. But the more information, the more feedback we get, the more I can help make this a bit more useful for you. Also, somebody asked a question about the coursework assignment on the forum. And it was actually in that general discussion week 1, which for some reason now has been closed because we've moved into tutor groups. So you should all have your tutor group. Anyway, I asked, because I couldn't reply to the question, I asked for it to get moved into General Discussion 2, or Week 2, or General Discussion 2 at the top of the VLE, and there I'll start making announcements because I can't access anymore the General Discussion 1. Anyway, the question was about what I said last week about the coursework, and I asked for you to select a commercial property, and it is expected that this would be an office. I said that commercial property is also a rather broad definition, and I may have confused you, so sorry if I've confused you. My intentions are, if you're in, say, the United Kingdom, I would expect you to use an office. But my intentions were, because some of you may be in countries in other parts of the world where you may not have access to a suitable office building, then I think perhaps you could base your subject of your assignment on another type of property. But please speak to me first. Please clear it with me first, just to confirm if the property is suitable or not. If you're in the UK or Europe, then I expect you should be easy enough for you to find an office. If you're not working in real estate at all currently, or if you're not even working in an office and have no access to an office, even if you are in the UK, etc., just please write me or speak to me, and we'll see if we can get a shop, or if you can find a suitable alternative. Certainly anybody can walk into a shop and look at a shop and analyse the market from that point of view, but we'll talk more about this later. The other thing to mention, as I touched on, is tutor groups. You should now be in tutor groups. I've asked for it to be set so that you should be able to see the other tutor groups also, but it may not have worked. I know that Hannah has it set up so that she can see everything in my tutor group. I think it was Godfrey last week. You'd like to see the more expanded tutor group so we can get a better discussion going. So we'll see if we can get this to work. I think it's recognised that the more of your fellow students you can see, then the better. Of course, it might become too unwieldy at some point, and you might just be better seeing what's going on in your own tutor group. So this week we will be looking at material We're looking at both weeks 1 and 2. Because last week we only had time to do the introduction to the course without looking too in depth at last week's question. I presume you've already read the study papers and made a go of the question. I saw that at least, I think, 10 of you had already posted, which is excellent. One other thing about those study papers, well, I remember, is I've been asked before if I can convert them into a point-and-click e-learning type program. I've been told that some of my colleagues in our IT department who create these materials, they've been experimenting and are trying to do this, although it's unlikely to be finished before the summer. So I'm not sure if the study papers will be in another format this session. At least when they're PDFs, you can look at them on a tablet, look at them on your phone, print them off, do what you like with them. Let's see, week 1's topics. I'm not going to dwell really on these. Much of it's simply a revision, as I said, of the background to the property industry, the investors, the property types, the idea between well, these two are easy. Valuation and worth you maybe not differentiated before, but you'll look at that through the course of this module. You can also see here I've got the 5 methods of valuation. Now some of you will be using these each day. Some of you will only have been exposed to them through studying at USEM or elsewhere. Mostly in this module we will concentrate on the investment method, but comparative method also plays a big part of it. There was previously quite a lot in profits method, but and cost-based method, but these are sort of put into the background now. Where it's been quite specialised and not terribly useful to most of you in your day-to-day work. Those of you who are outside the UK will no doubt be using investment methods, using a DCF approach, DCF calculations. So we'll be covering these in a lot more in more depth. And well, certainly the residual method that we look at in this module is maybe less of the sort of residual method approach that you'll have seen before, where you have a gross development value, then you calculate the costs and you deduct the two, and you deduct one from the other, then you deduct developer's profit to get a land value. What we'll do is we have a week where you will see how we do this using a DCF, which is very much common practice throughout the world. It's only in the UK we're a little bit different, where we have these 5 methods of valuation. As I said before I pressed record, before I started the session, I'm waiting for some videos. Actually, I've received the videos today. They should be a bit more helpful. One shows you how to use Parry's tables. One shows you how to. One's a simple sort of another explanation of investment method for those that haven't quite gotten into it, including the sort of the basics of the year's purchase formula and the yield and perpetuity, and then the present value of that type formula. So only 5 minutes or 10 minutes these videos, but useful for you to look through. And there's another one on leasehold valuations. And these were just prepared by my colleague here, who's actually the program leader for the BSc Real Estate Management program. He's decided that his bachelor students, undergraduate students, could do with these videos. But I think they're useful resources that you guys could use as well. And there's another one in zoning, so he's made 4 videos up. And if you find these useful, and if there's any topics that you would like us also to make up short videos for, let us know, and we'll see if it's practical. We can do the same for other parts of this module, or for other concepts that maybe aren't obvious. Yeah, Godfrey typing, you have a question? You want to ask something before I go on? No. T-Bar, you wanted to ask something? Yeah. You notice when you're using the traditional investment method to value profit rent, the dual rate in the parish table is used, and DCF, the dual rate, is not used. Is this the method to be applied? Yep, very good question. Generally, whenever you see a leasehold in this sort of context in USEM, you'll be answering questions in exams, and there it's expected you'll use the parish dual rate. This module includes a week on criticism of the dual rate method, and there, hopefully, after completing that, you'll be able to answer your own question as to whether it's better to use DCF or using the dual rate, and how they work together. So that's not going to be for some weeks' time. But in general, because you don't really do complicated DCFs in exams, whenever you see a leasehold type question, use the Paris booklet. It has all the calculations done for you. Okay. Okay. So, moving on, here we see the topics that you're covering now in week 2 again. Some of it is theoretical, but it really has a practical aspect, and that a knowledge of what is contained in these 2 papers would be relevant to maybe 90% of a valuer's typical workload. I'm not going to look at them now. First of all, I'll look at the week 1 forum question before returning to what this week will cover. So this is what we asked last week. Properties let at a rent of £32,500 per year for the next 3 years in an FRI lease. If it were to be let now, if it were vacant now, it would probably achieve £40,500. And we're told the all risks yield is 7%, and use example 5.4 in chapter 5 to help you. Anybody have any problems with this? Any questions? I saw 10 or so of you have posted on the forum. There's not really so much to add. Once one person puts down the answer, another person puts down their answer. You know, it's you can only disagree with them or agree with them. Now this is fairly typical of some of the work a valuer might be expected to undertake. In the real world, before you get to this stage, you'd be asked to consider rental evidence from similar properties and make a comparison with the subject that you are valuing. You'd also have to compare recent sales, where you would analyse property transactions. You'd look at passing rents and compare to the sales to see if you can get an initial yield. This yield, or this capitalisation rate, would form this yield would form a starting point for your capitalisation rate, I should say, although the terms are used interchangeably. If you have empty or vacant properties, then you might get a handle, an idea of vacant possession, and you could work out the capital value per square metre also. Here though, we're given the passing rent and the rental value, so it's quite a straightforward calculation. So, some different answers. Not too varied. Here's my initial versions of the term reversion layer method. Some of you may be used, let's see if I can get my pointer. Some of you maybe used the all risk field for the term and added a risk premium to the reversion rate. What I did here, and this is sort of the way that I learned at university, was to take off some percentage for the term because it's a known factor, and then use the all risk yield as the reversionary rate. I think I've seen before, maybe not this year, maybe last year, there was some of you adjusted both the term and reversion rates, and I saw smaller than 1% adjustments to the term. I think I commented on the forum. It's important. You could still get full marks for such questions. It's important if you're into the habit of just explaining, just one sentence, one line explaining why you've selected a particular rate. Here I would just say something like, I've deducted 1% from the all risk shield to give to represent that this is a less riskier proportion of the investment. Of course, if you read your textbook, we'll come to this shortly. If you read your textbook, there's a counter argument to this process. When I was at university, it was just common practice to take off 1%, although really you should take off for something that's linked to market. I've done something similar also for the core of the layer method, where I've kept all risk shield at 7 as the known amount, and the unknown amount in the future I've got at 8%. So I've added on 1%. Anyone disagree with this? I saw William, you were typing something, possibly. Do you work in valuation? You do something different? So one note here, as I've written, some textbooks differ on core and top slice rates. It's completely open to discussion, frankly. One textbook I've seen. Yes, sorry, the core is absorbed by the top slice at rent review. Well, the theory of the mechanics of the valuation is that assuming the property isn't under rented, that core, that amount of that money is from here for to ever, forever, in perpetuity. But the top slice we're valuing differently because it's got a different capitalization rate on that portion because it's unknown. In this example, it's not going to be realized for 3 years anyway. If you read the textbook, it would maybe mention somewhere the reasons against this. It's not even arithmetically correct. So frankly, all I want to see if you do a valuation like this is sensible cap rates and a line explaining what you've done. There's no single correct answer, and they depend on the particular attributes of the asset. And in one textbook, I can't remember which one, it suggests valuing the core at all risk yield -1, or minus a risk profile, and the reversion at all risk yield. I'm happy either way you do it. Other question, other things about this. Should we adjust the capitalization rate at all? Let's say if the term is only for 6 months. Any ideas on these? What would we do? Depends on what the market's doing. Yep, I think that's true. That's a very valid point. True for everything. Depends on the market. If the market's rising, or has been rising, and when you're in practice, generally you have to be able to defend what you're saying, and I think when I've found and I've been working, it's always just needed sensible discussion to get over these little what ifs. Gareth, you say if the term is only for 6 months and the income is at significantly lower risk, so should we value it lower? Should it be 2%, or 3%? I mean, that's probably getting towards, or maybe a bit silly. Some properties, some real estate assets can take a year to sell. Anyway, the transaction can take a long time. But it's good to think about the logical extremes. What about if the term is 20 years until review, or till renewal? What would you do? We've got an all risks yield of 7%. How would the market treat that? I see a good number of you typing. Right, first of all, T-bar, can it depend on the tenant's covenant, i.e. it's a bank? Yep, absolutely. For investment grade property, or for any sort of investment property, the capitalization rate will be highly sensitive to the first of all the remaining term until renewal, and also to the covenant, the quality of the tenant. But we're not given this information here, so we can assume that it's all we're comparing like with like, and we'll just look at the sort of logical differences between the term years. Some people might actually find a 20-year lease attractive, more so than a 1-year lease, depending on the market. And as Gareth says, it also depends on the difference between passing rent and market rent. Yep. These are all legitimate. These are all correct answers, and these are all things that we have to consider logically. Would it make a difference in London or the CEE? Well, probably T-bar in the CEE. You don't have 20-year leases in Hungary. Certainly, not much. Yeah, not many. Traditionally in the UK, we would have had institutional leases of 20-25 years, but even they're becoming less common since the 2007 crisis. In general, though, in the UK, we would expect there to be rent reviews, regular rent reviews. In T-bar's market in Budapest, or in Hungary, you would see, in the whole of that region, you would see rents rising each year based on retail price index, or consumer price index, thank you. Or what is HICP? Market something, harmonized price index of consumer prices. So every year the lease will say you'll increase. So whoever's purchasing will expect the rent to increase. Whereas in the UK, we would probably keep the rent the same for a certain number of years, either for 3 years or for 5 years, then have a review. And then the lease would be ratcheted up to market rent for a while. So if there's 20 years until a rent review in the UK, then the answer is in the UK we would probably expect that the yield applied, the capitalisation applied, would be much higher because it's a less attractive asset. In 20 years' time, rents could double or triple, or it could be far higher than they are now. So you're going to buy a property with no prospect of growth unless the tenant leaves. I think that's what this question is getting at. We don't tend to inflate leases rents each year by a price index. Okay, and yeah, I've mentioned covenant strength is poor, and if passing rent is higher than market value, both mentioned already. So I think we're fine with this. I think if tenant covenant strength is poor, then it would attract a lower price, and therefore the price would reflect a higher yield. And if passing rent is higher than market value, well, we might say there's more chance of the tenant defaulting, the tenant trying to leave, and we would put a higher capitalisation rate. Remember that higher the yield is reflective of a high risk. Okay. Yeah, Godfrey, you're typing something. You've got a question before I move on? I'll move on while you're... yeah. Passing rent higher than market rent, use the equated yield. Well, we'll come on to equated yield. Equated yield is essentially the same as what you have in a DCF. I think with these term reversion, it's better to look for equivalent yield, because equated yield means that we're explicitly accounting for growth. And if the passing rent is higher than the market rent, then there's going to be negative growth. So the functions doesn't really make so much sense in that case. So it could be that just a term reversion would be more suitable. Got it. Okay, good. So here we've got over rented property. Questions inverted. How should we value this? The property is let at a rent of 40,500 for the next 3 years, and the full market rent is 32.5. The all risk yield is 7%. What do we do? What do you do in the markets? Some of you who are maybe cap rent at 8% for 3 years. Yep. I think it's fair. It would give the overall values a bit lower. I mean, this is assuming a good covenant, assuming everything else, all the other features of the property are fine. Then reversion, all risk field. Yep. Okay. Yep. So in this example, the question is, should we adjust it? And arguably, yes. We depend on if it's likely or not that the tenant will want to move. It depends on how long until the lease ends, the terms of the contract, etc., the penalties for reneging on the contract. In the 2007-2008 financial crisis, I worked on several properties where the tenant was paying more than the rent. How do you value that? Well, very often, as it happens, the tenant was able to go to the landlord and ask to pay less rent. The landlords at the time knew fine well that if the tenant left, they would have an empty property for a long time. And it was better to have a tenant in paying a smaller rent than no tenant in at all. So there were a lot of deals done or temporary rent reductions. If the lease expires in 10 or 20 years, then the risk is even greater. The longer that the tenant has to, the longer that the tenant has savings to gain by leaving, then the more likely they are to leave. If they're under pressure, for example, be keener to leave or to renegotiate the lease. I remember that with the financial crisis, many of the shops had a downturn in sales and therefore could not afford their rents. And that meant that certainly if you're running a shopping mall and 1, 2, 3, 4 shops leave, then there's compounding effects, and it's much better to have occupied units, even if some are paying no rent. At least they're paying their contribution towards perhaps the security or the electricity or the service charges, because at least you want to have some hope of attracting people in. So, possible solution. My possible solution as or Williams' solution is +1% on the term here, and then YP reversion. Open to debate, open to argument, as most things in valuation. Consider the risk profile, consider the length, covenant, etc. Okay. Other thing you'll see, and this will be new. You maybe haven't touched on this in valuation and ethics, unless I taught it. But it's more and more common to use a single rate now in practice. If you've got any of the earlier or older textbooks, you maybe don't see this. You'll maybe just see the term rate and the reversion rate. But valuers in practice now, certainly with the bigger firms, they use a single rate. They might put in differing rates for different income components initially. They will consider how that value that comes out compares to their comparables, and then they maybe adjust the inputs. They would look at the income profile and risk profile, consider the initial yield, reversionary yield, and they blend these and recycle the calculation. Sometimes this is called the equivalent yield method, and I believe this is called in your textbook, your Bauman-McMinn textbook. I don't know whether you call it equivalent yield or single yield or however. In the exams, I want to stress it does not matter if you use a single rate or a term and reversion rate, as long as you explain your adjustment and as long as they're not ludicrous, as long as they're realistic in terms of what you've been given with the question. And as you'll see, they both using the same rate for the term and the reversion, the hardcore and the top size, you get exactly the same answer. Just all arithmetical logic. So finishing off last week, advantages and disadvantages. Many of you answered. Some of you put some good ideas down. In general, at master's level, for any valuation approach or any valuation method, you should be capable of critiquing that method. You'd have possibly learnt this already in Val 7 VAE, but you should know the advantages and disadvantages, and for really, really, really good 100% exam answer type students, which you all can be, you should be able to propose alternatives, suggest alternatives, and maybe know where current thought is. But for this one, term and reversion, traditional method, the advantages are understood by the profession and quick to perform. Two ones that came to mind when I was writing out this slide. Disadvantages, arithmetically incorrect, as the Bauman-McMinn textbook tells us. And of course, overlooks the fact that any purchase or any sale is only a single transaction. And you're buying both the term and the reversion, and therefore the cap rates cannot truly be separated. To be able to determine two capitalization rates correctly, then the valuer needs to have analysed the market properly, and this is very difficult. And in any case, when it comes to buying and selling, there's always going to be a deal done. The seller's opinion, the buyer's opinion of value might differ, and they'll maybe, if they're close to each other, they might just agree a compromise. And what can we conclude? Look at the term, decide if the all risks yield should apply to the term or to the reversion, and decide if the adjustment should be made. And as I said before, you won't lose any marks as long as you explain your reasoning. And I should add, as long as your capitalisation rates are sensible. Any questions on these so far? Any question about the topic? I think we've done this to death now. Okay. Week 2. What have we got? This looks a bit fuzzy. It doesn't look so clear, does it? But we've got your study paper, 2 study papers to read, to look through. Reflection 2, which is very important. I'd like to see as many of you tackle this as possible. Three exercises to do, so that's it. Yep. One is to answer questions on the theory of yields, and that is reflection 2. And the other, we've got another special collaborative wiki. Have you seen this? Have you tried it? This one here, market information wiki. I'd like to see you think about your local markets and what you know about the markets, and put in some information. So rents and yields. If you have 3 sectors, fine. If you only know what office rents and yields are, then fine. Just fill out the table. It's all confidential. You don't need to put in any information that is sensitive to your clients. Just approximate figures will be fine. And I think there's also another opportunity. I think you can click through it to another forum. If you can't click through it to a forum, then put your thoughts on this forum and on anything you observe. You can do this any week on the weekly forum for that week. Feel free to put your observations, discuss, or ask questions. And if you haven't done so already, we've got this final task. It says format your assignment submission. I don't know why it says format, because you're not formatting really. It's really just the assignment instructions. Please read the assignment instructions and start thinking of a suitable suitable market or your approach, or how you're going to tackle. As I mentioned in last week's introductory course overview webinar, the coursework in this module occurs quite on, so please do look at the submission part. Back to that wiki exercise. Here you can see the screen grab. Collaborative document. God, it's difficult to say that. Collaborative document. So you should all be able to open and add your own, and edit and add your own information to it. As I mentioned, you don't need to put anything confidential in, just typical market levels for the market in which you work. I'd love to see one example from each of the 3 sectors from all of you. I started you off by putting some in from last year's, where they knew the rent, the all risk yield, and the growth rate. It'd be interesting for me to see where UK markets are, or even, sorry, abroad. It could be any country. I'm happy to see anywhere in the world. I'm pleased to see from as wide a range of markets as possible. I think you're going to be have to looking anyway at this stage for the local market, as it will be pertinent to your assignment. What else? Week 2 exercise. As of this morning, when I looked, nobody's attempted the forum exercise. I want to see you attempt, I think it's reflection 2. I want to see the calculations part of it. I don't want to go over the paper and mental valuation of this webinar, and it's a topic you should read on your own. It's pretty straightforward, and I think it's a better use of the webinar of our time here to look at the other paper, the theory of yields for valuation. And therefore, this week we're looking at the traditional model and taking it and taking some very other pertinent measures of investment. And I think who was it? Was it Godfrey? You asked about equated yield already. So here we have these 4 terms that are crucially important to us as valuers and also to this module. You should if you take anything out of this week as material, these you should be able to define these 4 terms, and these are good questions also that you could get asked in your APC if you were thinking of joining the RICS. Now, up until now, in questions in exam or questions we've been tackling, you've been given an income stream, maybe a lease rent and a term, and you've been told the market rate. Remember, you don't normally have a market yield. Sometimes you have to derive that market yield where you derive the capitalization rate. And this yield, this concept of yield and rent is crucial to us, so this is why we're going to look at these 4. We've got initial yield, which is simply the relation between current income and price. This is if you're analysing an investment for sale, or if a property has sold, is simply the relation between the passing rent and the purchase price, and often allowing for cost of purchase. However, in some markets these are already grossed into the yield, so sometimes we don't allow for the cost of purchase, sometimes we do. Reversionary yield, a very important factor when thinking, say, of purchasing a property. You might be the investors will be looking at not only what's the rent now, but the market rent, and when that rent steps up to the market rent, that yield will have increased, and that's what we call the reversionary yield. And it's I guess we can explain it as a relation between the rent receivable at a future date and the price of the property. Also known as final yield, you'll see that written, although I would say this is wrong. Investors, when reviewing their historic projects, talk about the reversionary yield as at the day. So it can't be final if it's ever moving because the rents are increasing. And the reason that a yield can keep increasing regularly is if, say, let's imagine you buy a shopping centre with lots of units. It may be that every few weeks a new lease is signed or a new rent is agreed, and therefore we say that the yield has been managed up. You'll hear that term, managed up. And possibly also rents are increasing in each rent review, assuming the market is rising. So this reversionary yield could be moving. So the next 2 are a little harder to understand. Does anybody know equivalent yield or equated yield, or what's the difference? I mentioned it a bit in passing, but I maybe spoke too quickly to make much sense. Equivalent yield could be a comparative yield. Comparative to what? Peer properties. Is it yield after purchase costs? Well, let's say that any of these could be net of purchase costs. For simple reasons, I'm assuming now that there are no purchase costs. So I'm just looking at the relationship between rent and passing rent and market rent and sales price. Certainly, we would use the equivalent yield, the output, to compare with peer properties in the market. Now, equivalent yield and equated yield are probably the two more confusing terms because they sound so similar. Yeah, equivalent yield is the same yield in term and reversion. Yep, it's actually a function of both. And Gareth, the yield that could be applied to both term and reversion to give the same capital value if adjustments were made to the input. Yep. Okay. Did you lift that from the textbook, or it's a good answer as well? No, I don't want to. I didn't want to. No, it's a very, very good answer. That's why. Yeah, the equivalent yield is basically the weighted average between the initial and reversion rate running yield. You'll be looking at that in the self-reflection self-reflection questions this week. An equated yield is the eternal rate of return for given explicit growth assumptions. So it's similar to the equivalent yield, but with growth. When I was thinking back to when I was going to do my APC, the interview to join the RICS, I can remember sitting in the examination hall and sitting waiting to go in, and I kept repeating, equated yield is growth explicit, equivalent yield is growth implicit. And with equivalent has the letter I in the middle, so is implicit. So I don't really know if that's a good way to remember or not, but yeah, please do try the reflection questions for week 2. And as you say, as Gareth says, it's a yield that could be it's a single rate yield that you would apply to both the term and reversion to give the same capital value. So it's I think of it as a weighted average, but it's not really. I'm not sure how it's weighted. It's certainly an average between the two. If adjustments are made to the input yields for each element, yeah, good. So remember that investors are also interested in return from capital appreciation, and the total return is the IRR. You've heard of IRR, everybody? Internal rate of return. This is based maybe on what you expect to sell a property for when you dispose of it. Of course, this is somewhat speculative. Investors are also keen to know how this investment compares with others, and they want to beat the returns from competing properties or assets in other sectors. They want to make sure that they compensate for risk and uncertainty, and they are usually looking at the return on capital employed. So we'll compare after they will make comparisons, after financing costs, etc. And this leads us on to the question about the relationship between risk and yield. And I think I touched on it already. That yield is risk, or at least a measurement of risk. Why does a shop in the city, in the centre of a city, sell for a yield representing 4%, but a similar size unit on the periphery of a regional town maybe sells for 8%, 10% or whatever? And that's obviously because in that situation there's less risk in the centre of the city. There's more potential tenants willing to pay more, and therefore more would wish to purchase the property could be sold quicker and thus be more liquid, and therefore the price goes up, and the price relative to income increases, and therefore the yield is lower. This is all quite simplified. I'm certain that you all know this already. I'll say that one of the most common complaints from assessors on the RICS interview boards, and I am an RICS interviewer, so I know fine well. One of the most common complaints is that there's a high number of applicants who cannot explain what a yield is or how it relates to risk. So that's why you might hear me stress it sometimes in these modules, in this module. So, as I said, I want you to have a look at initial yield, reversionary yield, equated yield, equivalent yield, and equated yield, because in this week's forum, this week's two, I want you to post your answers to the self-reflection questions. 7 questions, but I'm most keen to see how you tackle question 3, which is a property investments for sale at £250,000. The net rent receivable is £11,250 per annum. The lease is 3 years return, 3 years to run. The market rental value is £23,000 net. So this is a bit different. This time we're being given the sales price. We're not being asked to calculate the value, what the property might sell for. So everybody clear on this? Would you know how to work out the initial yield? Can any of you describe the initial yield? Nobody? Yeah. Okay. Yep. Gareth, how should we treat purchase costs? In this case here, I would assume that there's no purchase costs because we're just doing the function of the we're just trying to get the function of the logic really. In real life, it depends on your market. You would deduct, the purchase cost would be added on to the sales price. But here I just want to get the logic of the yields working. Yeah, in some markets, when you see yields, they're already implying the purchase costs. So it really depends on where you are. With some of the examples that we'll do in ValSIF and AVL, we'll be looking at quarterly in advance and true equivalent yield calculations, and there we will explicitly account for purchase costs. But for this simple week 2, it doesn't matter. So yeah, we've got we'll have a fairly low initial yield. Reversionary yield, we know it will be 23,000 divided by 250,000. Yeah. Okay. So we know our initial yield and we know our reversionary yield. What's the equivalent yield going to be? We know that it's an average of 4.5, or 4.5 and 9.2. What I want you to do is I want you to try and work this out yourselves and post onto the forum. You don't need to do it now. But as a clue, it has to be somewhere between 4.5 and 9.2. And once you've done that, I want you to please try to work out equated yield if the rents rise by 25% between now and the new lease being granted in 3 years' time. One way to do this is you set up your term and reversion model and deduct your cost of purchase. Well, the equivalent yield is going to be the same rate for both that gives an answer of 0. Can I clarify equated yield? Yep. Equated yield is where we're not looking at what the market is. We're not looking at what the market is now, because we know we've got a market rent and we've got a passing rent, but there might be 3 years until rent review, and we might make an assumption there that rents are going to increase, and that's how we get to this equated yield, because we're explicitly accounting for further growth. Whereas the equivalent yield, we're using only known facts. We've got the passing rent and we've got the market value, and therefore we're buying at a yield that is implicit of buyers and sellers' thoughts of what future growth will be. Because we're buying the property, we're paying a yield, for example, and we're expecting it to increase, but we're not stating what it will be. Whereas the equated yield, we're making a very explicit assumption. In this case, we're assuming that rents will rise 25% before the lease being granted. I think the study paper might explain a bit easier, a bit better than I can. So please do have a read. Please do try and post your answers, and remember that there's a difference between equivalent yield and equated yield. And I'll put the my solution either on the forum, or we'll go over it next week in the webinar. Okay. So are we happy? Do you want me to explain this again? It took me a while to get to grips. We're fine with initial yield, and we're fine with reversionary yield, and the equivalent yield is just the weighting of those two together. And the equated yield is, we've got the initial yield, and we're assuming that there'll be some growth by the time of the rent review, and thus we're rethinking of what this will be worth, what this will produce, but with our own expectations of growth. Okay. Any more questions on that? Is that harder? Is that easier? Or nobody's saying anything? You can all hear me still? Okay. Sometimes the webinar sessions switch off if we run on too long. Need to think about it. That's okay. Well, I'd be also delighted to have a discussion on the forums after you've had a look at this week's material. We're still only on the second day of the week. Well, please do have a go, and we'll discuss the answers either next week or during this week. Next week we'll be looking at DCF. Much of modern valuation is undertaken using discounted cash flow techniques, and those of you working outside the UK will probably use this most of the time in place of our investment method. You'll probably undertake residual valuations the same way. If you tried File 7 VAE last year, then you might have read some introductory information about the technique. This time we'll be using it a lot more. We'll be using it a lot more often in this course. It's required for the coursework, so you must get used to it. It's straightforward, but if you have any difficulty, then please, I think one thing, please, I'll tell you a solution. One of my colleagues, actually a program director, asked me if I had any resources for DCF, discounted cash flow. I just said type it into YouTube, and you'll find on YouTube a great amount of resources explaining some of these things. Some of them created by my colleagues, but you'll also find resources from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, MIT professors explaining some of the same concepts. So If you have any difficulty, then always just do a quick search and share what you find. You'll find hundreds of examples with explanations. So, now at the end of today's session, we've run over a little bit. Do I have any questions? Any points anyone wants to make? Before I pause the recording, my voice is going a bit. Nope. Somebody? Tibor? Yeah. Okay. No question. Okay. Please, if you do think of anything, post on the forum. I should note that I'm going to be, I have to use up my annual leave over the next couple of days. So it might take me slightly longer than normal to respond, but I'll be checking the forums virtually every day. It just might take me longer than usual to get an answer back to you. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks for listening.